Story number 1. The cold breath of the Appalachian spirit. Let me tell you something. There are places on this earth where the land itself seems to breathe, where the wind whispers in a language you don't understand, and where time feels like it's holding its breath. The Appalachian Mountains are one of those places. I didn't know that when I first ventured into those woods. Like most, I thought I was just going on another hiking trip, a weekend getaway in the wild, fresh air, a fire by the camp, and a little break from the chaos of life. Simple, but I was wrong. That weekend in the Appalachians turned into something I'll never forget. Something that haunts me to this day. It was late December, and the air had that crisp, biting chill that makes you question why you ever left the warmth of your home in the first place. Me and a group of friends had been hiking along one of the lesser-known trails, cutting through the trees with nothing but the sound of our boots crunching in the snow to break the silence. The beauty of it all, the way the snow clung to the branches like frozen tears, made it easy to forget the gnawing feeling in my stomach, that vague sense that something was off. We set up camp near an old, half-dilapidated cabin that had seen better days, the kind of place that, under the right circumstances, could tell 1,000 stories. But that night, it didn't seem to have any stories to tell. Instead, it sat there, quiet, as though waiting for something or someone to notice it. The fire crackled, its warmth a fleeting comfort against the cold, and we gathered around it, trading stories and jokes. The kind of stories you tell when you're surrounded by friends and the darkness of the forest is just a backdrop to the flickering flames. But even as we sat there, a part of me kept looking out into the shadows, my mind playing tricks on me. The air was thick, unnaturally still, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It started when one of the guys, Jake, suddenly stiffened. I saw the change in his posture before I heard the words. He looked around, eyes darting nervously into the trees, then met my gaze. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice low, almost too low. I shook my head. "What?" "Something's watching us," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. I laughed it off, because, honestly, that's what you do when things get weird in the woods, right? You try to brush it off, ignore it, or turn it into a joke. But Jake didn't laugh. He just kept looking into the trees, his face drawn tight, as though he could see something I couldn't. The rest of us tried to ignore it, but you could feel it in the air, that quiet dread, like a weight pressing down on your chest. Later that night, when the fire had died down to embers and the air had grown even colder, I felt it too. I had been lying in my sleeping bag, trying to sleep, when I felt it, a cold breath, soft and ghostly, brushing against my face. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. It was as if something had leaned in close, right next to my ear, just out of sight. I sat up quickly, my heart thudding in my chest. I looked around, but there was no one there. No rustling in the trees, no distant howl of a coyote, just silence. Silence so thick it almost felt suffocating. But the cold remained. It didn't go away. It lingered, hanging in the air like a ghost, wrapping itself around me. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I turned to look at the others. They were all still asleep, blissfully unaware of the strange chill that had settled in the tent. I thought I must have been imagining things. That happens in the woods, doesn't it? Your mind starts to play tricks on you when you're far from civilization. But the feeling didn't fade. It only grew stronger. And then, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was there, faint, almost imperceptible, like the wind was carrying words from a distant place, words I couldn't quite make out. I held my breath, straining to listen, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard my name. "Jason!" I jerked upright, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I hissed, my voice trembling. No answer. But the cold? That cold breath. That invisible presence. It didn't leave. It hovered in the air, seeping into my bones, into the very fabric of my being. I shivered, my body locking in place, like something was holding me there, keeping me from moving. I wasn't alone. But who or what was there? I knew I wasn't imagining it now. This wasn't just the wind or the night playing tricks on me. Something was out there in the dark. Something watching. Something waiting. I reached for the flashlight at my side, my hands trembling as I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness in a thin line of light. Nothing. I stumbled out of the tent, desperate for fresh air, my mind racing. Maybe I was just spooked. Maybe it was just the isolation playing with my mind. But as I stood there, my breath clouding in the freezing air, I saw it. The figure. First, I thought it was just one of the guys, maybe Jake. But no, this figure was too still, too silent. It stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the trees, its form indistinct, like a shadow that had taken shape. I called out, "Hey, who's out there?" No response. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I felt the blood drain from my face. The cold was unbearable now, creeping into my chest, making it hard to breathe. I turned back to the tent. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. But the chill didn't leave. It stayed, clung to me, even as I rushed back to the safety of the fire, heart pounding in my chest, mind spinning with questions I didn't want to answer. The next day, when we packed up and made our way back down the trail, none of us spoke about it. We didn't need to. We all knew. There was something out there, something ancient, something tied to the land, to the mountains themselves. Some stories say it's the spirits of those who lived in these woods long ago, the wild men who had disappeared into the forest, never to be seen again. Others say it's something else, something older, something that was never meant to be found. We never went back. Not a single one of us. The Appalachian Mountains have their secrets, and some of them are best left undisturbed. As for me, I don't talk about that night. I don't tell anyone about the cold breath, the whisper, or the figure standing in the dark. I don't think I need to. There are some things in this world you don't need to explain. You just need to run from them. And I ran. I ran as fast as I could. Because out there, in those mountains, there are things that should never be seen. And once you see them, you can never unsee them. Story number 2. The Silent Watcher. You know, people think they understand fear. They think they know what it feels like. But you don't really know it, truly, deeply, until you're alone in the wilderness, with nothing but the wind and the trees to keep you company, until you feel that creeping sensation, like eyes are on you, and you realize that something is watching you, something that isn't supposed to be there. I learned that lesson the hard way. It was the middle of winter, one of those biting, bitterly cold nights when the air feels like it might freeze your very bones. I had been hiking through the Appalachian Mountains for days, looking for a stretch of wilderness to conquer. A solo climb. It was my thing, always had been. There's something about being up there, in the stillness, that clears your mind. It lets you breathe in the purity of the world, away from the noise and chaos of daily life. But this time was different. I felt it the moment I set foot on that trail. I was in a part of the forest that didn't get much traffic, a place where the trees grow close together, the branches nodding above like the fingers of old men, keeping the light at bay. I'd been trekking along the narrow trail for a few hours, my boots crunching through the thick layer of snow, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The quiet was almost oppressive, pressing down on me with a weight that made me feel like I wasn't quite alone. I told myself it was just the isolation of the place. The mountains had that effect on you. But deep down, I knew there was something else, something I couldn't explain. It started as a feeling, the kind that's hard to shake, a sensation that someone, or something, was watching me. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia. After all, who wouldn't feel like that out here, alone in the woods, with nothing but the trees to keep you company? But then, the feeling didn't go away. It lingered. It grew. I kept walking, the crunch of my boots the only sound. the stillness almost too much to bear. I'd stop every now and then, turn around, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing, just the forest silent, frozen, empty. But it wasn't empty. It never is. Not really. I pushed forward, thinking maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me, or the way the snow settled in strange patterns that made it seem like something was moving behind the trees. But as I kept going, the feeling intensified. Every time I stopped, I heard something, a branch snapping, a soft crunch in the snow, like footsteps. I spun around, heart pounding, but each time, there was nothing. I thought about turning back. Maybe it was the mountain playing games with me. Maybe it was nothing more than my mind unraveling under the isolation. But something kept me going. I was too deep into it now, too far from the world to turn around. So I kept walking. That's when I saw it. It was at the crest of a hill, a small rise that overlooked a small clearing. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the snow, and I thought for a moment that it was just a trick of the light. But no, there was someone there, standing on the top of the hill, a figure, dark against the backdrop of the white snow, just standing there, still, silent. I froze. For a moment, I thought it was another hiker, maybe someone else who'd gotten lost or decided to take the same trail. But the longer I stared, the more I realized something wasn't right. This figure wasn't moving, not even a twitch. It just stood there, watching me. My heart started racing. I called out, not sure why, hoping for some kind of response. "Hey!" My voice cracked through the silence. "You okay? Do you need help?" But there was no response. The figure didn't even acknowledge me. It just stood there, unmoving, a dark silhouette against the light. I took a step forward, my breath catching in my throat, and I called out again, louder this time, but still, no answer. My instincts screamed at me to turn and run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, caught between fear and curiosity. I took another step, and then, just as I moved a little closer, the figure did something that made my blood run cold. It moved, but not like a person would move. It was almost fluid, like it wasn't even part of this world. One moment, it was there, standing in front of me, and the next, it was gone, vanished, without a trace. I stood there, staring at the empty hilltop. I felt the wind against my face, heard the faint rustling of the trees around me, but there was nothing else. Nothing. It was like the figure had never been there at all. I called out again, but my voice sounded weak, small against the vastness of the mountains. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It was still there, hanging in the air like a cloud, thick and oppressive. I turned, slowly, scanning the trees, the hill, the surrounding area, but there was nothing, just the endless white of the snow and the dark silhouettes of the trees. It was then that I realized I was no longer alone. The thing, whatever it was, had never left. It had just disappeared. But not really. It was still out there, watching, waiting. I didn't know how long I stood there, but I knew I couldn't stay. My legs felt like lead. But I turned and started walking back the way I had come, my pace quickening with every step. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen. But there was no rational explanation. There couldn't be. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The trail back to my camp felt longer than it had on the way in, each step heavier than the last. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still behind me, something just out of sight, always just out of reach, but never far enough away. That night, couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, shivering, wide-eyed, staring at the shadows of the trees outside, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The mountain was silent as death. And still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the watcher was out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for me to make the slightest mistake, waiting for me to venture too far into the unknown. The next morning, I packed up quickly, didn't say a word to anyone else on the trail, and left the mountain as fast as I could. I still don't know what I saw. I don't know if it was real or if it was just my mind breaking under the pressure. But one thing I do know, I will never go back to that place. Because some things are meant to be left alone. Some things are meant to stay in the shadows. And I have no intention of ever meeting the Silent Watcher again. Story number 3. The Appalachian Monster. I've worked as a park ranger in the Appalachian Mountains for more years than I care to remember. The mountains are beautiful in the way that only something ancient can be. There's a calm about them, a stillness that feels eternal. But there's a darkness in those woods too, a kind of weight that hangs in the air, a heaviness that's not quite right, as though the trees themselves are keeping secrets. I've heard the stories. Of course, everyone who works in those mountains does. Old-timers talk about things that aren't quite human, shadowy figures, strange creatures, things that move just out of sight. But I never believed it. Not really. I thought they were just stories, part of the local folklore that gets passed down to scare the newcomers. I was wrong. This happened one winter, during one of the coldest, loneliest nights I've ever spent in the mountains. There had been an early snow that year, thick, heavy, the kind that falls silently, like the world's been muffled by a blanket of white. I was assigned to a small, forgotten ranger station deep in the woods, far away from the well-trodden paths. The station hadn't been used much in years, but I'd been sent there to keep an eye on the area while the others were busy elsewhere. I didn't mind. I'd worked nights before, and the solitude of the mountains had always suited me. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the quiet, the deep, unnatural quiet that only a heavy snowstorm can bring. It's not the kind of silence you can get used to, presses in on you, weighs down on you, until you feel like you can't breathe. I had been patrolling the outer areas of the station, making sure everything was in order. When I first heard it, a low rumbling sound, almost like thunder, but deeper, more menacing. It was too deep to be a storm. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bear, though that was unlikely given the time of year. But then the ground beneath my boots trembled slightly, just a little, but enough to send a chill crawling up my spine. I stood still, my breath coming in short, quick bursts. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't an animal, it was too big, too heavy. My first instinct was to turn and run, but I didn't. Curiosity, or perhaps stupidity, kept me rooted to the spot. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and started moving toward the sound. The beam of light cut through the falling snow, but everything around me was just darkness. The trees loomed tall and foreboding, their twisted branches bending under the weight of the snow. I walked cautiously, every step crunching in the snow, every breath a cloud in the cold air. The sound was unmistakable now, louder, like something enormous moving through the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was heading straight for me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my grip tightened on the flashlight. Though my hand was slick with sweat, I stepped carefully, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But the snow made everything sound so much louder. I was almost there, just a few yards away from the clearing where the sound seemed to be coming from, when I saw it. A shadow, a massive, dark shape, barely visible against the backdrop of the snow-covered trees. It was moving, but not in the way an animal moves. It was too slow, too deliberate, as though it were searching for something. The figure was huge, towering even, with a hunched, twisted posture that made it look almost unnatural. The air around it seemed to shimmer with something, like static before a storm. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The smell hit me next, a foul, rancid odor that made my stomach churn. It was a mixture of rot and something worse, something that burned in the back of my throat. I wanted to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. My body refused to move, frozen in place by some primal instinct. The creature, whatever it was, didn't notice me at first. It was too absorbed in whatever it was doing, swaying, moving through the trees, a blur of darkness against the snow. I took a step forward, trying to get a better look. But as soon as I did, it stopped. Completely. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, slowly, the creature turned its head. I froze. It was like time stopped. The thing's face, if you could even call it a face, was a nightmare of twisted features. It had deep, sunken eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, too large for its skull. Its mouth was stretched into something resembling a grin. But it wasn't a smile. It was something far worse. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The teeth were sharp, yellowed, and far too many. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. I don't know how long it was. Could have been seconds. Could have been hours. Time doesn't make sense when you're staring into something that shouldn't exist. The creature's eyes locked onto mine. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't just a creature. It wasn't just some wild animal. It was a thing that had no business being in this world. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, turned its back on me and began to move away. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it were part of the shadows themselves. I didn't wait to see where it went. I turned and bolted, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs like jelly beneath me. I didn't stop running until I was back at the station, the door slamming shut behind me with a finality I couldn't shake. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. Couldn't. I knew they'd think I was crazy, but there's no way to explain it. No way to make it make sense. It's been years since that night, but I still hear it sometimes. The sound of something huge moving through the trees, the rustling of branches, the distant, rumbling growl. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the mountains, I feel it, the presence of something watching me from the shadows. I've heard the stories. People talk about creatures in the Appalachian Mountains, things that lurk in the dark, hidden from the world. Some call them the wild men. Others call them something worse. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I'll never forget the eyes. The cold, dead eyes that stared at me from the darkness. They're still out there, waiting. Maybe they're still watching. Story number 4. The shadow in the snow. I've never been a man prone to believing in the supernatural. But the night I spent in the Appalachian Mountains with my friends changed all that. Maybe it was the quiet that did it. Or maybe it was the snow. There's something about snow. Something that makes the world seem far too still. Far too empty. And the cold. The kind of cold that goes right to your bones. The kind of cold that makes you feel like the very air around you is alive. I should have known something was wrong the moment we set foot on that trail. But we didn't. We never do. Do we? I remember it like it was yesterday, the way the snow clung to everything. Thick and heavy, as if trying to swallow the world whole. We were a group of 5, all of us friends from college, eager to get away from the noise of the city. We thought a weekend hike through the Appalachian Mountains, away from the hustle and bustle, would do us some good. Little did we know, we were heading straight into something that none of us would ever forget. We set up camp in a remote area, far from any other hikers. The fire crackled, sending plumes of smoke into the air. But it didn't seem to warm the world around us. The night was black, unnaturally black, like the mountains had swallowed the stars. We were close enough to the trail, but far enough out that the sense of isolation was palpable. Sitting around the fire, we joked about the usual things: school, work, ex-girlfriends. But there was an underlying sense of unease that none of us could shake. The wind had stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that pressed down on us. And the snow, which had been falling lightly earlier, had now picked up, thick and heavy. That's when we heard it. First, it was faint, a rustling sound coming from the snow-covered trees at the edge of the clearing. We all stopped, eyes wide, straining to hear. The sound wasn't like an animal. There was something too deliberate about it, something too human. It was the sound of something or someone moving through the snow, but the way it moved didn't make sense. The footsteps were too light, too swift, as though whoever or whatever it was wasn't leaving tracks. Probably a deer, Dave said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was trying to convince himself. just as much as the rest of us. Yeah, right, I replied. Dear, don't move like that. We all fell silent, listening. The sound came closer, then stopped. For a moment, there was only the wind, whistling through the trees. Then nothing. We stared at each other, our breath visible in the cold air. I'll go check it out, I said, standing up. Maybe it was foolish, but something inside me urged me to get up, to see if there really was something out there. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the way the silence had taken over, making me feel like I had to break it. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the edge of the camp, where the trees stood like silent sentinels in the snow. The light from the campfire barely reached that far, leaving the woods shrouded in darkness. I moved slowly, carefully, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the blackness. Nothing. I paused, listening. The air was so still, so dead, that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it, a shadow, moving in the snow. It was quick, too quick, moving like it was gliding through the storm. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow darted past a thick tree trunk, vanishing before I could even blink. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. Did you see that? I called out to the others. No answer. I turned around, my flashlight scanning the camp. But everyone was looking at me, wide-eyed, mouths open. You saw it too? I asked, my voice shaking. Yeah, Dave muttered, his voice barely a whisper. What the hell was that? We stood there for a few moments, not knowing what to do, when the sound of footsteps came again, louder now, approaching from the same direction the shadow had vanished into. This time, we all heard it clearly, heavy, deliberate steps crunching through the snow, moving quickly, coming straight toward us. Get the gear. Now, I shouted, adrenaline surging through me. We scrambled, each of us grabbing our things. But none of us dared to leave the warmth of the fire. I was the first to grab the tent. But as I turned to head back to the group, I saw him. He was standing just beyond the firelight, a figure in the snow, a man, I thought at first. But something was wrong. He was tall, unnaturally tall, his clothes tattered and worn, a dark hood obscuring most of his face. But the worst part? He wasn't moving, not even a flicker. He was standing completely still, staring at us with a presence so palpable. Felt like the world had paused. The man had the look of someone who had been lost in the mountains for far too long. Who the hell is that? Mark whispered, barely audible. I didn't answer, couldn't. I stepped forward cautiously, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Hey, I called out. Are you lost? Do you need help? The man didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me. His posture was stiff, as though he were frozen in place. I stepped closer, my mind screaming at me to turn around, to run. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned away, almost too quickly, and disappeared into the snow. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing. I looked at my friends, but none of them had any words either. We stood there, paralyzed in the cold, waiting for something else to happen. But it didn't. The footsteps had stopped. The shadow had gone, and the man had vanished. We didn't talk much as we packed up. There was nothing to say. What could we say? We all knew what we'd seen, but we couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason for it. No way to rationalize what had happened. The man, if he was even a man, hadn't left any tracks. No footsteps. No signs of him having passed through. It was like he had melted into the night. By the time we had everything packed and ready, we had made up our minds. We weren't staying another minute in that cold, desolate place. We hiked back down the trail, not saying a word to each other. But we all knew that none of us would ever return. Not to that spot. Not to the place where the shadow had watched us. And I'll be honest, I still hear those footsteps sometimes. Not in the snow. Not in the woods. But in my dreams. The crunch of snow under heavy boots. The sound of something or someone coming for me. It's always just out of sight. Always just out of reach. But I know it's out there. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear it again, the footsteps, and I wonder if the shadow is still watching, waiting for someone to wander too far into the dark. Because in the Appalachian Mountains, some things are better left alone. Story number 5. The Wild Man of the Appalachian Mountains. There are places in this world that feel like they don't belong to us. Places that have a life of their own. A rhythm that we can't understand. The Appalachian Mountains are one of those places, stretching over 1,000 miles from the southern United States up to the north. They've been home to legends and stories since long before we ever put up signs and trails. Long before we ever thought we could tame them. But it's not the mountains themselves that I want to talk about. It's the things that live in them. The things we can't explain. The things that hide when you're not looking, but make themselves known when you least expect it. And that's the kind of place the Appalachian Mountains are. A place that will never truly reveal all its secrets. I'll never forget the winter I spent out there with a group of hikers, thinking we could conquer the wilderness, that we could walk the trails like we owned them. We were wrong. It started like any other camping trip. A few friends, couple of tents, and a good dose of adventure. We were supposed to follow the Appalachian Trail, a long hike through some of the most beautiful, untouched land in the world. The first few days were perfect, crisp air, snowy hillsides, the kind of cold that lets you know you're alive. We set up camp in a clearing one night, feeling good, excited for the trek ahead. But something in the air felt off. Maybe it was the silence. The kind of silence you don't often find in the world. The kind that's so thick you can almost feel it pressing against your skin. We were sitting around the campfire, trying to stay warm as the night crept in. When it started, the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. At first, we thought it was a deer or maybe some other animal. The crunching wasn't exactly like footsteps, but it was close. Too close, actually, too loud to be anything natural. We all looked at each other, unease settling in like a cold weight in our stomachs. No one spoke, but we could all hear it, the steady rhythm of steps getting closer. I was the first to stand, my heart pounding in my chest. Though I don't know why, the rest of the group followed suit, gathering near the fire. I squinted into the darkness, trying to see if I could make out what was causing the noise. That's when he appeared. From the thick shadows at the edge of the camp, a figure stepped out. A man, though calling him a man was a stretch. He was tall, too tall. His shoulders hunched in a way that suggested he hadn't walked upright in a long time. His clothes were ragged, torn at the edges, and his hair hung in wild clumps around his face, obscuring most of it. His beard was long and tangled, and his eyes were the worst part. They were wild in a way that made my blood run cold. They weren't just empty, like someone lost in the woods. They were full of something primal, something old, something that belonged to the earth itself. We all froze. No one moved. No one spoke. He didn't speak either. He just stood there, staring at us from the edge of the camp, his feet sinking into the snow. The night around him was so still, the air so thick with tension, that it felt like the world itself had stopped. We couldn't hear the wind. We couldn't hear the usual rustling of the trees. We couldn't even hear our own breathing. All that mattered was him, this wild man standing in the dark. One of us, David, I think, was the first to break the silence. He called out, asking if the man needed help. But the wild man didn't move. He didn't acknowledge David at all. He just stood there, like a statue, his gaze never leaving us. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know if we should approach, if we should stay away, or if we should run. But then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the wild man turned and disappeared back into the trees. No words, no warning. He simply walked away into the dark, leaving us standing there in the cold. We didn't sleep much that night. We kept the fire going, our eyes flicking nervously to the tree line, expecting him to reappear at any moment. But he didn't. The next day, we packed up camp and continued on our hike. But the tension hung over us. The memory of the wild man clung to us like a shadow, following us through the trees. As we walked, we kept our eyes on the ground, looking for signs, looking for clues, and that's when we found them. We were walking along a small ridge when we spotted something in the snow. At first, we thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a fallen branch or an animal's tracks. But as we got closer, we saw it clearly: footprints, big ones, but not just big, wrong. They weren't like any human footprints I'd ever seen. The shape was off. The toes were too long, the prints too deep. They didn't look like they'd been made by boots, and they certainly didn't look like they'd been made by anything normal. They led off the trail, into the woods, and we followed them, not because we wanted to, but because there was something inside us that wouldn't let us stop. We kept walking, following the footprints until we came to a clearing, a small, barren patch of earth surrounded by thick trees. That's when we saw it. Or, rather, didn't see it. There, in the clearing, was nothing, but the air felt wrong. The trees seemed too close, the shadows too dark, the world too quiet. It was as if we had stepped into a different world, a place that didn't belong in the reality we knew. We turned to go back, but the tracks didn't lead back to where we came from. The wild man's footprints had disappeared, just like he had the night before. We didn't speak on the way back. We didn't need to. The feeling in the air told us everything we needed to know. Something was out there, something ancient, something wild, living in the Appalachian Mountains, something that wasn't supposed to be seen by the likes of us. We never spoke of that night again, at least, not with each other. But every time I go back to those mountains, I remember the wild man, and every time I hear the sound of footsteps in the snow, I wonder if it's him, watching, waiting. I wonder if I'll see him again, because in the Appalachian Mountains, some things are meant to stay hidden, some things are meant to be forgotten, but sometimes, they're not. Sometimes, they come back, and sometimes, they never leave. Story number 6. The mysterious figure in the woods. The cold winter air of the Appalachian Mountains cuts sharper than you'd expect. It bites through your jacket, gnaws at your skin, and leaves you feeling like you've been skinned alive from the inside out. I know this better than anyone. I've been a park ranger in these mountains for over 10 years now. And if there's one thing I can tell you about working in the woods, it's that nature doesn't play by the rules. And on that particular night, nature had a new trick for me. A trick that would haunt me long after I left. I was on a routine patrol, just checking up on a remote area of the park that most people don't ever see. The sort of place where the trees grow thick and tall, where the light barely breaks through the canopy, and the only sounds are the calls of the birds and the occasional rustle of a fox or deer in the underbrush. But tonight, the woods felt different. The night felt wrong. I remember the first thing I noticed as I walked through the snow. The silence. It wasn't the quiet, peaceful kind of silence you get when everything is still. No, this was the kind of silence that felt suffocating, like the forest was holding its breath. Even the usual crackling of the snow underfoot seemed muffled, swallowed up by the dark. I kept walking, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness, trying to push away the nagging feeling that something was off. I checked my watch. It was past midnight. The temperatures had dropped, and I could feel the frost creeping through the layers of my uniform. The cold was starting to get to me, but I forced myself to keep going. I'd seen enough of these nights to know that I just needed to finish my rounds and get back to the warmth of the station. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow playing on the snow. But as I squinted, I realized it wasn't. A man, standing motionless in the middle of the woods, like a statue. His clothes were ragged, almost falling apart, and his face was obscured by a wild mass of gray, unkempt hair and a long beard that reached down to his chest. He stood there, unmoving, like he was part of the landscape, as if he'd grown out of the very earth beneath him. I called out to him, my voice loud against the stillness. "Hey, you all right?" No response. Not even a twitch. Now, most people would have been unnerved by this. Hell, I was unnerved. But I'd been in enough strange situations to know that people get lost in these mountains. Sometimes, you find someone who's just wandered off the trail, looking for a shortcut, or maybe someone who's been living rough for a while. I wasn't expecting a simple encounter like this to spiral into anything more, but something in my gut told me it wasn't going to be that simple. I moved closer, my boots crunching on the snow. The closer I got, the colder the air seemed to become. My breath fogged in front of me, and I could see the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There was something deeply unsettling about this man. Something that didn't sit right. He didn't seem human. He looked too still, too unnatural, standing there without any sign of life, like he wasn't really part of the world anymore. When I was about 20 feet away, I stopped. I tried again, shouting, "Hey, you need help." Still nothing. Then, as if on cue, the man turned his head, slowly, deliberately, like he was stiff from standing in one place for far too long. His eyes, those eyes, were the coldest I've ever seen. Not cold in the way you'd expect, but cold like a void, a deep, bottomless black that seemed to suck in the light around them. And then, he looked at me, not in a way that made you think he was acknowledging my presence. No, it was as if he was studying me, like I was some strange specimen that didn't belong in his world. For a split second, I thought about running. I should have. My instincts screamed at me to turn and get the hell out of there. But my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place, locked in this silent stare down with whatever the hell this man was. Couldn't look away, couldn't even blink. And then, just as quickly as he had turned, the man, this thing, turned away from me and began to walk off into the trees. No words, no warning, just a slow, deliberate stride, as though he had been waiting for me to move, to make a decision. And once I hadn't, he was free to do what he came to do. I followed him with my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. And as I did, something in my gut twisted. Something wasn't right. I started to step forward, unsure of what I was doing. But before I could even make it a step or two, the figure stopped, and then he turned back around. He didn't walk. He didn't even move toward me. He just vanished. 1 second, he was there, standing in the shadow of the trees. And the next, he was gone, completely gone. No rustle of leaves, no crunch of snow underfoot, nothing. I blinked, hoping that my mind was playing tricks on me. I'd been out in the cold too long, and maybe I was starting to hallucinate. But no, I was wide awake. My heart was still hammering in my chest. I looked around, shining the flashlight in every direction. There was no sign of him, no footprints in the snow, no trace of the man I'd seen only moments before. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the woods, waiting for something, anything, to explain what I had just seen. But nothing came. I turned back, slowly at first, not wanting to take my eyes off the dark forest behind me. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, and the silence was broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I finally gathered enough courage to make my way back to the station. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't going to forget what happened. The woods, the darkness, the man with the cold eyes, it was all wrong. It didn't make sense. But that's the thing about the Appalachian Mountains. The deeper you go into them, the less you can trust your senses. The more the land starts to feel like it's alive, and you're just a visitor passing through. A visitor who might never leave. And that figure, I never saw him again. But there's a part of me that believes he's still out there, somewhere in the woods, watching, waiting, silent. I don't know what he was, or what he wanted, but there's something I do know. Some places in these mountains, some places are better left alone. The woods have their own secrets, and they don't give them up easily. Story number 7. The man with the strange eyes. I've never been the type to scare easily. I've spent more nights in the woods than I care to count, hiking, climbing, and trekking through some of the most remote places in the Appalachian Range. The mountains, they've got this kind of pull on you, you know? This draw that keeps you coming back. Over and over again. Most of the time, I'm out there to find peace, to get away from the noise of the world. But that night in the Appalachian woods, I found something else. Something that I can't explain. Something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It was late December, the kind of cold that bites through to your bones. And the snow had been falling all day. The sky was dark by the time I made my way up the narrow trail. I was alone, as usual. It wasn't the first time I'd hiked these parts at night, but something about that evening felt off. Maybe it was the silence. The woods had an eerie, still quality to them. No animals, no rustling of leaves, not even the wind. Just the sound of my boots crunching through the fresh snow and the occasional snap of a distant tree branch. I was about 2 miles deep into the woods when I came across a spot that I'd never noticed before. A small clearing, barely wide enough to be called that. Surrounded by trees so dense they seemed to swallow up the light from my headlamp. I paused for a moment, unsure if I should continue or turn back. There was a strange heaviness in the air, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I didn't know why, but I decided to keep going. And that's when I saw him. At first, it was just a silhouette, tall, thin, and standing in the center of the clearing, as if waiting for me. His figure was vague, barely discernible in the dim light, but I could make out the outline of a coat, dark, tattered, and filthy. It wasn't much of a surprise. Hikers sometimes get lost out here, and there's always the possibility of running into someone who's wandered too far from the beaten path. But there was something about this man that set me on edge. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I felt it, deep in my gut. A coldness, a dread, something unnatural that twisted in my chest. I called out, just as a courtesy, "Hey, you lost." No response. I wasn't sure if I was even speaking to a real person. The way he stood, unmoving, with his head slightly tilted, gave the impression that he was waiting. For what? Couldn't tell. His eyes, though, those eyes, they were the first thing I noticed. They were wrong. They weren't the dull, lifeless eyes of someone lost or confused. No, these eyes were too sharp, too focused, like they were staring straight into me, into my soul. I tried to make out more details, but the darkness made everything seem a little off. There was something strange about his gaze. Intense, almost predatory, but not in the way you might think. It wasn't like he was sizing me up. It was more like he was studying me, dissecting me from the inside out. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that was spreading through my body. "You okay?" I asked, a little more firmly this time, stepping forward a few paces. Still, no response. I had no choice but to keep moving, right? I couldn't just stand there staring at some guy in the middle of nowhere. Not in the middle of the night. So I took another step, then another, but I kept my eyes fixed on him. My instincts, honed over years of solo hikes, screamed at me to turn around and run. But my curiosity got the better of me. As I moved closer, I could finally see the details more clearly. His face was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, as if he hadn't eaten in days, maybe weeks. His clothes, ragged and torn, were caked with dirt and something that looked like dried mud. His hair, wild, long, and matted, hung over his face like a curtain, making it even harder to see his features clearly. He didn't look like he belonged out here, not in the way I did. He looked out of place, like he'd been here for far too long. When I was about 10 feet away, I made the mistake of looking into his eyes again. God, they were like nothing I'd ever seen. Not human, not alive, but something else. They were pale, almost white, with no pupils, just empty, milky orbs staring straight at me, unmoving, unblinking. A chill ran through me, and for a moment, couldn't breathe. I opened my mouth to say something, maybe to ask if he needed help, but the words stuck in my throat. He wasn't speaking, and for some reason, I didn't feel like I could. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't move. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, the man slowly turned away from me, his face remaining hidden by that thick mess of hair. Without a word, without a sound, he began to walk into the trees, disappearing into the night like a shadow. I stood there for a moment, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to turn around, to run, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. Something kept me rooted to the spot. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was something else, something deeper. A sense of wrongness that I couldn't shake. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring into the darkness where he had vanished. But eventually, I snapped out of it and ran. I ran like my life depended on it. Back the way I came, never looking back. I didn't care about the trail or the path or anything anymore. I just had to get out. When I made it back to the main trail, my mind was still reeling, but I kept going. I thought about the man with the strange eyes, and I couldn't help but wonder, who was he? How long had he been out there? And why was he waiting for me? The rest of the hike went by in a blur. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, and even then, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to be standing there, watching me from the woods. I've never talked about this before, not to anyone, not even my closest friends. Sounds crazy, I know, but when I think about it, when I really think about it, I don't think he was human, not really. I think he was something else, something that has lived in those mountains for far longer than we have. And I know this for sure. If you ever find yourself hiking alone in the Appalachian woods at night, and you come across a man with eyes that look like they're from somewhere beyond this world, you turn around, you walk away, and you don't ever look back. Because whatever he is, he's been waiting for you, and once you see him, once you meet his gaze, you can never forget it. You'll feel those eyes on you. Even when you're hundreds of miles away, you'll hear his footsteps in the dark, and you'll wonder if he's out there, still watching, waiting.